All right. Good morning. With the number of retired military people and a congresswoman that has to get to Congress, we're going to start right on time. So, typical JINSA fashion. I'm Mike Makovsky. I'm President and CEO of Jewish Institute for National Security of America. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. I want to welcome you officially to unveil JINSA's newest report, the Gaza Conflict 2021 Assessment. The report on the May 2021 conflict between Israel and Hamas is being issued by a task force of 12 retired U.S. generals, admirals, and military and legal experts deeply familiar with the challenges of fighting a terrorist adversary. We've issued similar reports in recent years, including in 2015 on the 2014 Gaza conflict. As with the other reports, this one is informed by on-the-ground fact-finding mission, extensive interviews, and really in-depth research. And I'll just highlight a few key points, but before I do that, I really want to thank all the task force members for all the hard work. And it really is not just the travel, but all the work that went involved in this, and also our really excellent policy staff led by Blaise Mishtal, our VP of Policy, Jonathan Rui, our policy director, Ariel Davidson, and Andrew Galili. And also, so I want to thank them really for all the hard work in working with the retired generals and putting this really, I think, really in-depth, serious report together. So let me just highlight some key topics. I'm going to turn it over to the Congressman. One of the key topics is the legality of Israeli operations. Israel's military was frequently accused in May by Hamas, by the media, by various commentators, of illegally killing Palestinian civilians. This report thoroughly analyzes the legality of Israeli operations in Gaza, as you'll hear from the panel. This was also the first, what the Israelis have called the first AI war, the first artificial intelligence war. Task Force examined Israel's technological innovations and how they were used in the conflict. Also, what are the lessons for the United States? Fundamentally, this report is about what the U.S. military can learn from Israel's experience. As you'll hear from the panel, the challenges Israel faced last May, particularly disinformation, are likely to confront U.S. troops in the future. With that, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, Congresswoman Elaine Luria of Virginia. She proudly represents Virginia's 2nd District in the House of Representatives. She serves on the House Armed Services Committee as Vice Chair. She's also on the House Committee on Homeland Security, the House Committee on Veteran Affairs. Prior to Congress, Congresswoman Luria served 2 decades in the U.S. Navy, retiring with the rank of Commander. We appreciate very much all your service there, along with all our retired generals on our panel and in our task force. Of all the members of the House Democratic Caucus, she has served the longest on active military duty. She was also the first woman in the Navy's nuclear power program and among the first women to serve the entirety of her career in combatant ships. She served at sea on 6 ships as a nuclear-trained surface warfare officer, deployed to the Middle East and Western Pacific, and culminated her Navy career by commanding a combat-ready unit of 400 sailors. She is really a steadfast friend of Israel in Congress, standing up for Israel's right to defend itself. Congresswoman Luria, please join us. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you and good morning. And it's really an honor to be invited to help kick off this panel discussion. And I'm very pleased to see the result of, I was trying to think about, you said my 20 years of naval service, the number, 12 general and flag officers and others who put the work into this. There's hundreds of years of military service and expertise that went into putting this report together. And I think it's incredibly important for many reasons. One is, that after this conflict, the left, those on the political left, not just in the U.S., but, around the world, the amount that people have villainized Israel for Israel's right to defend themselves has gone up precipitously. And I think it's a really dangerous trend. And I think that, comprehensive analytical works like this report are the kind of things that will, be useful tools for everyone who has to stand in a place sometimes like I do to defend Israel's right to exist, Israel's right to defend itself. And, since I've served in Congress, I've found that it's been quite surprising the amount of times that I've needed to stand up on the House floor and do just that. Actually, the first time that I ever spoke on the floor of Congress as a new member was to stand up and speak against claims of anti-Semitism, lobbied from members of my own party, unfortunately, about claims of dual loyalty. And I stood up and spoke, basically as a Jewish woman and military veteran who served for 20 years to confront that. But, I think that those issues of anti-Semitism that we've seen continuing to grow in the country, combined with misinformation about the conflict, the recent conflict in Israel, and other claims about Israel's military action to defend itself, have become quite dangerous. And I think that all of us who care deeply about the U.S.-Israel relationship can use this report and the information herein not only to re-emphasize the importance of the U.S.-Israel relationship, but also, as was said in the introduction, to learn more about the tactics and procedures that were used during this conflict, how those could surface again. We know that many of Israel's adversaries on their own borders are funded by Iran as proxy organizations, and understanding how they use these tools, how they use these tools in different ways in this conflict, is something that we certainly need to incorporate within our own forces. I was quite surprised this year on armed services when General Brown, the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, made a comment in one of our hearings that the U.S. has lost air superiority in the Middle East. And a big contributor to that is the use of drones and the way that drones are being employed, and better understanding examples of when that has been done, and how that could be replicated in other places is very important. So I think the work of this study is necessary for that. I mean, when we look at this 11-day conflict, there were 4,400 projectiles that were lobbied or that were fired into Israeli territory. That is more than during the 7-week period in 2014. Of those, the ones that were targeted towards population centers, 90% were stopped by Iron Dome. So getting back to another topic that's incredibly important is our continued support for Israel and our continued support for replenishing Iron Dome. This year's NDAA, which we've passed out of the House already, and the Senate should be acting on that soon, it does continue to include the $3.3 billion for security assistance, as well as the additional $500 million for missile defense. And on top of that, our recent vote to replenish Iron Dome was almost unanimous. Unfortunately, the fact that it wasn't completely unanimous is one of those challenges that we're dealing with from some on the far left who, I think truly would prefer to say that Israel doesn't have a right to exist. But it was about 420 votes in favor of that additional emergency funding, and working with the Senate, I believe they'll be including that in their version of the NDAA moving forward. But continuing to provide that strong support, that support for Israel to have the ability to defend itself, especially with such a technologically advanced and efficient air defense system from missiles coming towards Israel. So I just, wanted to wrap up again by saying that, it's incredibly important that we have such a distinguished group of individuals who've collectively served hundreds of years in our military, and that they, take the time and effort to look so closely at what has transpired recently within Israel, in order to both provide recommendations and assessments that can help, both the Israeli military, the U.S. military, and our allies and partners, learn from the ways that warfare is continuing to develop, in the 21st century. So thank you again for having me, and really look forward to hearing your remarks and studying the report more closely. So thank you.
Thank you, Congresswoman Luria, for those remarks and for joining us this morning. Thank you to everyone who's here in person and watching us at home for tuning in. I'm Blaise Mishtal, the Vice President of Policy here at JINSA. It's my honor to get to introduce our distinguished panel today. But without stealing their thunder, I also wanted to say a few quick words to highlight some of the top level, I think, lessons learned from this report. And for all of those of you who are watching at home, you can go to our website at jinsa.org to get a copy of it. I really see sort of 5 key takeaways here. about what we can learn from this conflict. The first is that adversaries learn from past conflicts, and one of the interesting things to watch has been the way that Hamas has adapted its tactics, its techniques, and its capabilities as it learns from its multiple engagements with Israel. The second is that adversaries learn from each other, and I think particularly for the U.S. military, it's one of the key questions is what will other actors watching how Hamas conducted this campaign learn about how to operate, and what might they deploy against the United States going forward, in particular the way that Hamas was able to effectively use disinformation against Israel. The third, as Congresswoman Luria mentioned, is that partners depend on the United States. A lot of Israel's success in this operation, both in terms of defending its own civilians against those 4,500 rockets that were launched into Israel, comes from Iron Dome, which has been supplied and was the U.S. helped create, and its ability to operate effectively in Gaza and do so while protecting civilian lives in Gaza was thanks to the precision-guided munitions that it uses that come in part from the United States. Fourth, the U.S. can learn from its partners. There are both limits to how much Gaza is going to resemble future conflicts the United States might face, particularly as we confront issues of limited air dominance, as Congresswoman Luria mentioned. But there's also examples that we can learn in terms of both Israeli operations and technological innovations. And then finally, it's important to also remember that this conflict with Hamas came against the background of a greater threat for Israel from Iran and from actors to its north like Hezbollah. And as we think about the parallels of that for the United States, that even as we prepare for great power competition, we might be facing conflicts from other lesser threats that we need to be able to manage as well. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel, which will be moderated, and then we'll turn to the audience both in person and online for questions. For those of you watching at home, there should be a feature that allows you to submit questions, which we can receive here and pose to the panel if you'd like. Let me start with our panel, starting from my closest to me. General Chuck Wald is the former Deputy Commander of United States European Command. He also served as the Air Commander for CENTCOM for Central Command at the beginning of the Afghan War in 2001, and he was the Director of Strategic Planning and Policy at U.S. Air Force's headquarters. Next to him is Lieutenant General Robert Ashley Jr. He's the former Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He previously served as the G2, the Army Chief of Staff for Intelligence. He also served as Director of Intelligence for both U.S. Army Joint Special Operations Command and at Central Command. We have, next to General Ashley, is Lieutenant General Thomas Trask. He's the former Vice Commander for United States Special Operations Command. He also served as the Deputy Director for Theater Plans at Central Command, in which capacity he was responsible for planning against Iran. Finally but not least, we have Jeffrey Korn, who is the Gary A. Cooper Distinguished Professor of National Security at South Texas College of Law, Houston, where he specializes in the law of armed conflict. Prior to his academic career, Professor Korn served as a U.S. Army officer for 21 years, including as Chief of International Law for U.S. Army Europe. He retired with the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. The panel's discussion will be moderated by Eli Lake, who is a Bloomberg opinion columnist, and I think probably one of the most go-to reads in Washington on national security and foreign policy topics. He was the senior national security correspondent for the Daily Beast, and he also covered national security and intelligence for the Washington Times, the New York Sun, and UPI. So with that, let me turn it over to Eli for our panel discussion.
Thanks so much. Well, this is a very important report and an interesting one, and I want to just start off with some of the basics. So if I could start at my far end with Professor Korn, explain just in a sort of 5,000-foot kind of level the law of armed conflict and why there has been, in your view, such a misperception of what the law of armed conflict says in mainstream media, particularly when there are these sort of mini wars that crop up with Israel and Gaza.
So thank you for the opportunity to participate with this distinguished group. Look, at the very core of the law of armed conflict is a balance between a military commander's authority to employ combat power to bring the enemy into submission and the obligation to do it in a way that mitigates as much as feasible the risk to civilians, civilian property, and other protected individuals. That core framework is reflected in what military lawyers and international lawyers refer to the principles of the law. The most fundamental principle is the principle of distinction, which means that a military commander may only deliberately attack enemy personnel, civilians who participate in hostilities, and other things that qualify as military targets. And there's a mechanism in the law for determining when something becomes a military target. Anything can become a military target, even if it's presumptively civilian. And then another core principle is the principle of discrimination, which prohibits a commander from conducting an attack against a legitimate target in an indiscriminate way. For example, carpet bombing would be an illustration of an indiscriminate attack. And then finally, one of the most under-discussed but probably important principles is the principle of precautions, where a commander is expected to consider all feasible measures that can mitigate risk to the civilian population during the attack. Now, to answer your question directly, what do I think is the main cause of misunderstanding? It's hard to look back on an attack and determine whether or not there's been compliance with the law, because what you have to do is you have to look at the situation that the commander encountered at the time the decision was made. What the law does is it regulates the judgment of the commander, the attack judgment. It's much easier to look at the effects of an attack and extrapolate back from that there must have been illegality, what I've called effects-based condemnation, because that's easy. So if you see a building that's destroyed, it's easy to figure out who destroyed it. It was the aircraft that dropped the bomb that destroyed it. The problem is there's this instinctive assumption that the party that caused the damage is responsible for any suffering that was inflicted by that damage, when in fact, when you're fighting an enemy that doesn't care about the law, that doesn't care about its own civilian population, if you dig a little bit deeper, what you realize it's the enemy's tactics that are creating the situation where the commander has no option other than to launch the attack, even after doing everything he or she could do to mitigate that civilian risk. So to me, the biggest problem with the misunderstanding of the law and the biggest opportunity for nefarious actors to exploit the law to their advantage for their strategic information campaign is the misunderstanding that the law somehow completely prohibits the destruction of civilian property or the infliction of civilian harm. Sadly, that's a consequence of war, and the law doesn't prohibit that. What the law prohibits is trying to do that. And that's the big mismatch here, is because we had one party to the conflict that was consistently trying to kill civilians, consistently trying to destroy civilian property, and failed in many cases because of the effectiveness of defenses, and another party to the conflict that was trying everything possible to avoid that, but inevitably couldn't. But if all you do is look at effects, then you say the party that was trying is the nefarious actor, or that was trying to mitigate risk is the nefarious actor, and the party that failed somehow gets a pass. And all that does is incentivize the worst tactics of parties to a conflict that don't follow the rules. So the best solution for this is to remember what we're critiquing is the good faith commitment of a commander in battle to follow these rules, to target the enemy, to implement measures to mitigate risk. And that's why I think this group is such an important source of understanding of a conflict, because these are men who have made these difficult decisions, contributed to these difficult decisions, and when they look at what happened, they're not looking at just the effects of an attack, they're looking at the processes that led to the decision to launch the attack, and that's what we need to focus on.
I want to broaden it out to the rest of the panel. But one of the findings of this report is that there really was nothing that the Israeli side did to counter what you've categorized as misinformation. There was almost a sense of helplessness. We know we're going to get dinged, and we know that this is going to be condemned, and that's just going to have to be the price that we're going to pay. So in some ways, is there any chance that you're ever going to change at least the kind of media perception in some of the more mainstream outlets like the BBC or some of these late night shows?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to Colonel Corn's comments, and just it just struck me again. It's probably obvious to everybody, but I think the going in premise is countries have the responsibility to protect their citizenry. That's the goal, and we forget that going in position is Israel had the obligation to defend themselves, and we kind of make that an assumption. And Jeff, it'd be interesting for you to talk, because that's kind of the premise that everybody should start with, and then you go into the other issues that Jeff talked about.
Well, listen, one of the problems with the narrative about a conflict like the conflict that was studied is I think most reasonable people understand that a country has a right to defend itself. But then they fall into this trap that it's supposed to be kind of tit-for-tat self-defense. In other words, they fire one rocket, we're allowed to fire one rocket back. But as military commanders will tell you, that distorts the relationship between a strategic objective and the operational implementation of that objective. So if General Wald were the chairman of the Joint Chiefs or the commander of NORTHCOM, and the United States was being attacked by rockets from outside, the plan to respond to that would not be, well, every time they fire one, we'll fire one back. The plan would be to conduct a decisive military operation to disable the enemy's ability to continue to threaten the United States. That's what self-defense authorizes. So that you're absolutely right, sir, that there's a misunderstanding. So we'll say at the beginning of the conflict, yes, Israel's being attacked by rockets. They have a right to defend themselves. But then there's this kind of repulsion at the fact that they're actually doing it. But that's what self-defense is. It's just like an individual who's attacked. You're allowed to take necessary measures to prevent the enemy from continuing to threaten the country.
Well, sorry.
Back to your first question, you talked about, kind of the fact that Israel as a nation kind of just accepts that they're, no matter how they message this,
the report says.
Yeah, it's not going to be accepted. So I want to differentiate between disinformation and misinformation. So disinformation, when someone purposefully misleads you. So that's what Hamas has done. It's disinformation about the law of armed conflict and what are legitimate targets. The challenge becomes the misinformation, whereas the media, other entities will pick it up and take that as truth and then promulgate that as truth, which is actually misinformation. So two different and distinct things. But the challenges before the conflict is the degree of education in which you can take individuals like Professor Korn and educate media, educate a larger, broad audience about what really is the nature of the law of armed conflict. The challenge, again, is the confirmation bias. So think about the media and the sources in which you go and you listen, where you get your news. Does it reinforce an opinion that you already have? So there's a challenge in confirmation bias in terms of how you get that message out, but it has to be a very deliberate process long before conflict to help people understand that. But you can't seed that ground just because of a frustration of like, my message doesn't resonate. You still have to continue to work that. But you also have to think through it. So if you're going to go after a building, and that's one of the kind of the key takeaways, one of the shortfalls in this particular conflict is when the Jalal building was destroyed, the Israeli government, the IDF, was not prepared for the fallout and the messaging that really could have been immediate upon the time that they did that. So, bad baseball analogy is the World Series is over, kind of swinging behind the pitch, so to speak, and getting that message out. And it looked as if, and it was, that they were reacting to the very negative disinformation and misinformation that was promulgated after the strike. But, what the professor talked about is you have this very visual image of a multi-story building coming down, and then you're trying to counter the narrative that's coming out about the nature of the legitimacy of that target.
Can I jump in also, Eli? One thing to add further to that, as military people, we tend to look at it as like a military planner. So we started with what were the objectives, both of Israel and of Hamas, and we kind of focused on that. And that's where it came up immediately, where Hamas planned on this being an information campaign. That was how they were going to measure whether they were successful or not, was the perception that they created through their information operations. Israel focused on the operational degradation of Hamas. That was their operational objective that they went into the conflict with. That's why we remark in there both sides can claim victory, because they both achieved what they were going after. Israel and a lot of the folks that we talked to in the IDF recognized that they should have had information objectives built into the campaign from the beginning, so that they were ready to do exactly what Bob just described, so that when they're hitting a target they know is going to be sensitive, they should have that information piece built in so it's ready to launch as soon as the rocket comes off the rail.
If I could just sort of follow through, ask a sort of pointed question to the panel, which is, we've known since, the Second Intifada, 2000, that the objective of Palestinian so-called resistance has been largely informational. We know this because they place military targets very close to civilian areas. We know this because they spend a lot of time talking about, everything being a war crime. That's been the case for 20 years. Why has it taken Israel 2 decades to figure out that they are in an information war?
Well, I was involved with General Wald in the 2014 report. We did a report for JINSA on the potential for a conflict in the northern theater against Hezbollah. I'm not so sure that they don't understand this issue. But there's a complicated process of interagency coordination that's required to prepare the information warfare battlefield the way General Ashley suggests it has to be done. And I think that let's remember that this is a report that's designed to inform United States policymakers as well. So just as an example, you can have a public affairs spokesperson for a military commander, and you can give that public affairs spokesperson some bullet points, and they can come out and say, well, this is why it was a military target, et cetera, et cetera. But what you have to do is ask, is that the most effective way to prepare to influence the understanding, the accurate understanding of the decision-making process? Who should be involved in that? What agencies should be involved? Is there proper coordination between the military advocate general, the operational command, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Information? These are complicated issues. I think they understand it. And I think they also understand that there's a group of the audience that will never be influenced, one way or the other. There's predetermination on both sides. What you're fighting for is the margin, and that margin is really, really important. And you, as General Ashley says, you cannot capitulate on this. You can't just throw your hands up and say, we're never going to win this battle, because in my view, it's not just adversaries like Hamas that are reading these tea leaves, so to speak. The ability to sow disunity in a coalition or an alliance is a powerful strategic advantage for an adversary. So conventional peer adversaries are seeing this as well, that they can exploit a misunderstanding of what the law permits and doesn't permit to sow disunity between the military and political leadership and between the political leadership of allies. And that's a very dangerous proposition as you think about the type of conflict that the U.S. military is preparing for today.
I'm sorry, but if I could just push back on that, though, has there been much of a consequence? The Hamas and various Palestinian so-called resistance groups have been waging these kinds of wars for some time. The I would say, as somebody who covered this stuff 20 years ago, the level of condemnation from Western capitals was much greater than it was today. And in this same period, Israel has managed to forge the Abraham Accords, invite massive international investment into its tech sector, created a kind of revitalized relationship with China. Yes, it's lost friends in Turkey, obviously, and other places. But for the most part, Israel is more integrated in the world right now, despite this strategy. So is there an argument that maybe the commanders that you interviewed that sort of threw up their hands have a point? At the end of the day, it doesn't matter if Trevor Noah says something that is misinformation. There's always going to be this group of people who are going to hate Israel. That's fine. Israel kind of keeps on trucking.
If I could get back to that. So for me, as I look at the challenges of this, it's not a binary. You're either successful or unsuccessful. There's a lot of gray space in this. And I agree, the Abraham Accords, the fabric is changing somewhat in terms of the nature. But going back to the point of pulling this into what are the lessons learned for the United States, a strategic communications campaign and information strategy is really about all the national instruments of power. It's diplomatic, it's information, it's military, it's economic. And so think about that in the context of great power competition as we look at what China does with the Belt and Road Initiative, the other disinformation that they promulgate, and how we counter that. And so for me, as I look at, there are clearly lessons learned in terms of how to embrace this for the Israelis, but for the U.S., I think an example of where you can see success in this and doing it as a whole of government is look at how we countered Huawei. Look at how we went after the wolf warrior diplomacy for the Chinese. And so look at nations that are rethinking their relationship with China and the Belt and Road Initiative because of coercive economics and other things like that. So I think there are lessons, to be learned from this, but there's also impactful strategies that need to develop that are really a whole of nation. Because we can't just look at, the PA spokesman for the IDF, failed to counter this. This really is, what's the whole of government message, which I think is improving, but it didn't really exist and wasn't well nested in this particular conflict.
Yep. One comment I would make in response to your pointed question is that I think that the misinformation built on a distorted understanding of the law has effects at different levels. Okay, so the effects that were focused on by these generals were the operational and tactical effects. So I think at the strategic level, you make a good point that Israel has moved in a positive direction despite much of this. But at the operational level, the risk is that you're going to create situations where commanders hesitate to conduct attacks that are otherwise lawful, or when they conduct attacks, it creates a backlash that makes them more restrictive in the future. And it's a hard balance to strike. We know this. I mean, we've seen this in our own operations with restrictive rules of engagement, and there are times when they make perfect sense, where that type of restraint is wise and it serves an operational and strategic goal. But there are also times when an enemy can try and inflict that on you so that no matter what the commander does, it's perceived as failure. Either I hesitate and the enemy gets a tactical advantage, or I exercise my legal authority and it's used to create a false impression of immorality and illegality. And that's weaponization of the law, and it's a tactic that is increasingly common in the conduct of hostilities.
Yeah, I think what Colonel Corn just mentioned is exactly the issue. I think if you look, first of all, I think things are changing somewhat. It's not as stark or black and white as it was a few years ago that, okay, Hamas is, the good people and Israel are the bad people, and Israel has some tactical or technological advantage that's unfair. But it kind of struck me as I was sitting here, and all of us has been involved in military planning at different levels throughout our career. And we do war games, and we do exercises, and we do war planning, etc. And rarely has the information part of it, there's information ops, I get that, but has the information campaign been a strategic campaign along with the military campaign at equal levels, let's say? And I think these are supposed to be lessons for the U.S. military. You need really sophisticated people to go through this process of how do you actually plan the dialogue, if you will, or the reporting, if you will, of what's happening even beforehand. And the groundwork has to be set during non-conflict times, even though there's not going to be a lot of traction within some quarters for that. But the lesson I came away from this was, first of all, we talked about technology a little later, which is impressive. But this whole idea of the narrative is just critical as can be. And I think it's a great lesson for the military, either a relearned lesson for some people, let's say, but a huge lesson from the standpoint of how we do our planning for the future. And that's one of the big takeaways for me.
If I could just add to that real quick, go back to the Cold War. When we talk about, well, we don't do, and I hate to say information operations, but go back to what we did in the Cold War, Radio Free Europe, Voice of America. It resonated. It resonated with Eastern Europe, and it was successful. And there are great lessons to be pulled out of that, 1945 to really 2020, as you look at how we engaged with the Soviets and the Russians in the information campaigns that we launched. We've done that successfully in the past. And so there's a little bit of muscle memory there that we need to pull back into how we think about great power competition with our key adversaries today.
We're getting into the report a little later with everybody's portion of what they're going to discuss, but a key example, it's one example, but it's a critical one, was the Al Jalal building with the AP and Al Jazeera not theoretically, but actually located in those buildings. And the fact the Israelis hit it after various types of warnings, long time, ensuring nobody else was in it. But the Israeli spokesman at the time, they didn't have a real good plan to respond to that and why that attack had occurred. The same thing occurred that's going to be discussed, I think, a little later on, the fact that there was a kind of a feint for a ground invasion by the Israelis into the Gaza Strip. And what we're told is that the spokesman for the Israeli military had not been really coordinated with on that process, so made a comment, yeah, we've got forces next to the border and they're ready to go. And those two particular strategic issues really made a big difference. And so I think it's an easy lesson for us to learn, but a significant one for something very innocuous to most people.
The issue of the tower I think is really a focal point of this whole discussion, because look, there's an undeniable reality that in the reporting of conflict, there's always going to be a tyranny of disparate expectations, right? That there's going to be this expectation that the weaker side should be allowed to get away with more. But that's not how the law works. It's an equality of obligation on both sides. And what's fascinating to me is that the whole narrative about that attack was, why was the Israelis attacking a building that was used by journalists? What the discussion should have been is, why was Hamas embedding a vital military objective in a building they knew was being used by journalists? And when you come at it from that perspective, then the discussion changes significantly, which is, well, maybe they were doing it because they knew that either it would force the Israelis to forego the attack or give them an opportunity to evacuate their vital assets, or it would result in the attack, and then you've got this image that becomes the focal point of, well, there's your example of illegitimacy. And so there has to be a constant effort to remind external audiences that there's an equality of obligation. Even if you're fighting in an unequal kind of capacity, it doesn't release you from your obligation, because if we tolerate that, we're exacerbating the risk to the civilian population instead of mitigating it, which is really undermining the entire function of the law.
Yeah, and the other kind of subtlety is Colonel Corn can talk more about this than I can, but there isn't any distinction of the fact that let's say a under-capable adversary that starts something gets some kind of advantage in the fight, that they're going to give them a kind of a mulligan, if you will. You want to start a fight at disadvantage, that's tough luck. but there's this kind of human nature sympathy for an able adversary that takes on somebody. Israel's very capable, no doubt about it. But there's this kind of sympathy that occurs. That's the subtlety of the message that we have to get back out. That, hey, listen, if you're going to take advantage of the situation of people that don't understand actually how warfare works and try to advantage the message, tough luck. But we've got to do that in advance. At times like this, with people like Attorney Corn, are critical for people to start understanding this, because there's a human nature, a visceral sympathy for people that are the underdog, if you will. That's kind of convoluted in my estimation.
There's another piece of this in terms of what are you willing to disclose. So if from an intelligence standpoint, sources and methods, what's too sensitive, are you willing to disclose what you knew that was in the Al Jalal building, that there was an electronic warfare capability that had the potential to reduce the effects of Iron Dome? And so leaders, commanders, and national policy leaders have to talk about what are we willing to disclose for the opportunity to put that into a strategic communications message. And you see that same dynamic and pressure right now if you're watching in the U.S. side, where you've got the four-star commanders coming out going, we've got some incredible capability for deterrence, but I can't talk about it. And so I think General Hyten was one that recently had talked about this and said it's hard for me to be able to leverage that from a deterrence standpoint because of the overclassification as he determined that. But that's an interesting dynamic in terms of what is it you're willing to disclose and what's the effect you're trying to get out of it, and does that outweigh the risk of disclosing sources and methods, intelligence capability, access to certain locations. And so that's a dynamic that factors not only in this one, which is why it came out a little bit late, but that's something you're going to have to think about, as a commander in the U.S. That's a big area for us right now, especially you think about deterrence.
But this, I think, also goes to General Walt's point about kind of setting the conditions for a narrative of compliance and respect for the law and the rules up front. There are going to be many situations where the commander is not going to be able to disclose all the details of an attack. That's completely logical. It's not a one-off. I mean, this is a campaign. And every time you provide information about why we attacked, and what we knew, you're potentially degrading your ability to gather information in the future. What you can emphasize is all of the measures you took prior to the conflict to make sure that your forces and your commanders understood their obligations, embraced their obligations, the training, the preparation, the precautionary measures. Look at everything we've done. As a lawyer, as a former trial lawyer, what I understand that to be is circumstantial evidence from which you draw an inference. And what's the inference? This is not a military that is trying to violate the law. This is a military that's trying to comply with the law. So if you're not positive about why there was an attack, it supports an inference that there probably was a pretty good reason. When I saw that attack, that was my instinctive reaction, which is there must have been a really compelling military objective there, or else they wouldn't have done that. But that's only because I know everything that goes into that process in the attack decision-making equation. And most people don't understand that.
Yeah, first of all, I agree with that. The point Tom or Bob Ashley just made is a good one too. There's this comment by General Hyten that we have capabilities in the U.S. military that we can't discuss because they're too sensitive, but they are very capable. Actually, there's some wisdom to the fact he said that, because there's a certain power to ambiguity, and we can say things whatever you want to say, but not you, but about what our capabilities are. But if there's a modicum of truth to it, it's a huge deterrent for the enemy. And so that's part of the whole idea of information ops or having a story, is how do you actually weave that story on a day-to-day basis to become beneficial to you. So if I'm Hamas and I know I've got another capability out there that can totally eliminate all the mortars and rockets and artillery and everything else, I'm a little concerned about starting something. If I'm an adversary like China and the United States one of the senior people in our government says, hey, we've got some capability that you're not going to really like, but just trust me, it's there, I'm going to start questioning it. So that's just part of the sophistication of it.
I want to get to one interesting observation from the report, which is that Israel accomplished military operational objectives very well, but it didn't seem to have a sort of strategic end state in mind. And evidence might have been that at no point in the brief war did the rate of the rockets fired from Gaza diminish. That they weren't able to slow down the barrages. Israel certainly has the capability to reoccupy Gaza or to effect some kind of military regime change. It obviously has chosen not to do that several times. Does that, in your view, the lack of a kind of strategic insight, the fact that these wars seem like they're recurring and it's mowing the grass, does that lead in some ways to this perception that Israel has abused its power in these conflicts?
Let's make a real quick comment, and I'm sure the others have better things to say, but I don't think it's behooving of Israel to have a strategic end state for this. They're defending of a country. They didn't start the conflict.
I agree.
You know, so the fact that Israel didn't come up with a strategic end state, is to me kind of ludicrous. I mean, the fact is we're defending our country. That's all we can do, and that's what we need to do. Strategically, long term, Eli, good point. That how do you regionally and affect the whole situation from the standpoint of Hezbollah, Iran, let's say, or others? I get that, but from this perspective, it's not behooving of the Israelis to have a strategic end state necessarily. They're surviving, basically.
I think it comes down a lot to priorities for them too. Obviously, they make it clear always when you visit Israel that remember who the number one threat is for them. Sure. And so their focus is always going to be in Iran and to the north to some extent. And I think they consider Gaza certainly not unimportant, but a lesser priority, and to the point where a status quo with some kind of measured level of effort and munitions they would need to save. They're only going to take a certain level of effort to work in Gaza, and the status quo becomes effectively the operational objective as far as Gaza is concerned. But it comes down to national priorities, I think.
But they go into this knowing that they have they have operational objectives. So as quickly as they can to try to deplete, the mowing the grass phrase, whatever's in the inventory of Hamas. And even, part of the lessons learned for this is Hamas is able to start developing their own longer range capability. But it really was very deliberate. We're not going to do a ground war. We're not going to, displace Hamas. The intent here is to deplete their capability to reset deterrence for a period that's really undetermined. When's the next time? Because if you look at the different, kind of the periodicity between the conflicts, it's not the same. This time it was 2014 to 2020. So that's part of the intent. And there's a messaging piece of this as well in terms of deterrence and going back to other enemies like Lebanese Hezbollah or the Iranians as well. But picking up the op-tempo was another part of this one to try to do as much of a depletion as they could in the shortest amount of time. And part of that is understanding that the international community is going to come in and put a degree of pressure on Israel to come to cessation of hostilities and get everybody back to having we call it a very difficult peace in that context.
You can almost look at it as they mowed the same amount of grass in 11 days this time that it took 7 weeks to do in the earlier conflict, which reduced casualties on both sides and reduced damage in Gaza.
And there's the irony, right? There is a restrained exercise of the inherent right of self-defense that General Wald started with. So the strategic objective is to exercise the state's inherent right to defend itself against an illegal and unlawful attack. There was no plausible legal justification in international law for Hamas starting to launch those rocket barrages. If we did this as a law school exercise, a much broader campaign could have been legally justified. A ground incursion to seek to permanently eliminate this threat to Israel. They made a strategic choice to exercise greater restraint, and yet, in spite of the fact that they reduced the number of casualties on both sides, they reduced the duration of the conflict, Much of this was because of all of the efforts they made from 2014 to 2021 to enhance capabilities that enabled them to achieve their operational objectives faster, more precisely, with less civilian risk. In spite of all of that, right, it's the effects, the visual effects of the conflict that define the narrative. And one point I'd like to make about this whole issue of information, this is not a suggestion that there's any type of manipulation by Israel or the United States or a democracy. This is fighting misinformation with true information. This is being unapologetic for an institution that is devoted to exercising its authority consistent with law, and in many ways doing it in a way that is more restrained for strategic and operational reasons. That's not. There should be no hesitation to be proud of that. This is an operation that any military should be proud of. Now, that doesn't mean that there's an indifference to human suffering. No commander, I think, wants to inflict human suffering. But when you're fighting an enemy that's creating a situation where you cannot even achieve a limited operational effect without creating that type of destruction, what are you going to ask of that commander? To do nothing?
If I could hit just a bit on deterrence theory. So there's three legs to that, right? You impose cost, you deny benefit, and you have to be unambiguous in your messaging. Iron Dome. So that denies the benefit of the rockets, given about 90% effectiveness in what was fired into Israel. But the other is impose cost. And so what Professor Corns talked about is a degree of restraint. So look at the narrative where Israel is vilified in the context of actually could have imposed much more cost within the law of armed conflict, but they very deliberately chose not to do that. There could have been many more objectives, many more targets executed, and then the way that they went about it, the non-explosive knock on the roof, making sure everybody cleared the buildings, stacking multiple ISR assets over to make sure that it was cleared, reducing casualties. All of those efforts to mitigate meant those were targets that were not engaged, other targets, and the ability for Hamas and others to pull some of their kit out or some of their weapons and stuff. So the ability to impose cost could have been much greater. So you see a degree of restraint, and I think part of that, when you think about it, is that's the values that we all adhere to. That's the values that Israel adheres to in terms of how this was executed. And that in itself is strategic in terms of the way that was executed.
Yeah, I was sitting here kind of thinking about the report and the good work that Mike McCosey and his team continuously do on this to educate people like yourselves and mainly people that think about these things from a strategic standpoint, whether it be Congress or others. But it kind of occurred to me just sitting here thinking, Hamas has objectives. I think somebody's going to talk about that in a little bit. They failed. I mean, when you sit back and look at it, 11-day conflict, not trivial, but 11 days, and not anybody's talking about it. Matter of fact, you hear nothing about it in the news. You don't read anything about it. You don't read anything about the consequence of this 11-day conflict. It's almost a given. I would say
No UN inquiry that we care about.
no UN inquiry, which is the normal kind of reason JINSA gets involved in this, is because the UN's already written the critique before the conflict. They've got one for next time. But I almost think it's worthy of somebody looking at Hamas's success or failure on this thing and how they, it probably has to be internal. We don't want to give them any secrets. But I mean, I think when I look back on this and I read about it and I hear about it, I think it's a total failure on Hamas's part. That hasn't really been articulated.
But the effects are temporal, right?
Yeah,
and
right.
then kind of the Andy Warhol 15 minutes of fame, you see this in the press, and then it kind of fades away. And so now you have the opportunity for the education piece to really kind of look at what are your strategic communications and don't take your foot off the gas pedal, so to speak, in terms of how aggressive you are in that space.
I guess we have about 10 minutes left. Is that right? Half an hour left? Okay. Do you want to start taking questions from? One more, and then we'll go to questions. Oh, okay. All right. Well, I wanted to maybe talk about kind of picking up on this sort of lessons that Hamas has learned at this point. Do you think that that the Hamas does in some ways Hamas benefit from its very restrictive policy inside of Gaza in terms of the media? I've reported from Gaza before, but especially when there is a war, they vet every single journalist who with a camera that comes in.
I mean,
Is it possible then, I guess, maybe for this lessons learned report to apply to people who would get an opportunity to report from Gaza in the next conflict? Or is that system pre-rigged, so to speak?
I mean,
That there will never be journalists allowed in Gaza to report that
Well, you're a journalist. I mean, free press is the issue, right? For us, I mean, that's where you get objectivity and you have belief, and that's a hell of a tool for somebody to control the press. No doubt about it. So I doubt if Hamas is going to give up one of their major tools by allowing free press and freedom of the press movement in these areas. That's part of the challenge for the Israelis in this case, or the Western world that believes in this type of thing, to work against. It's just not going to change. Matter of fact, I would contend that it's Hamas's biggest lever is the press, at least the sympathetic press, if you will, or the UN in that case. And they know that very well, and they play it well. They're experts at it by virtue of necessity.
I mean, you would know this better than I would. I would hope that most professionals in the media who are reporting on conflict want to get it right, that they want accurate information. They want as much information as they can get. When I've been interviewed by the BBC or CNN, that's been my experience. The challenge is, how do you explain something that's inherently complex in a 2-minute soundbite when they don't have access to all of the facts on either side? Because you can say Hamas, I agree with the general, Hamas is not going to be open to allow the media to report effectively from the areas they control.
Well, I was asking a slightly different way, which is that Hamas knows that, especially journalists with a camera. I'm a print journalist, so I've gotten in a few times. But especially if you are a television journalist and it's in the middle of a conflict, that's really their bread and butter.
Sure.
That if a BBC cameraman moved the camera and showed where the rocket launcher was right next to the nursery school or something, that would be a huge problem for them.
Correct.
And that's one of the reasons why they're very restrictive about who they let in to film these conflicts. Whereas nothing like that really exists on the Israeli side. Yes, there have been some dust-ups in the past with, extreme activists and, in my view, some stupid decisions from the Israeli government at times not to let certain people in. But it's a totally different media environment. There's plenty of critical media all the time in Israel in these conflicts. And so that seems like it's never going to change. So my question is this education effort, I mean, are you ever, is the idea to sort of deal with the sort of bureau chiefs and people who are higher up in the news organizations? Or is there just as the Israelis that I think the commander you interviewed sort of thrown out, we're never going to win with these guys, this is just how it is, and maybe there was a sort of wisdom in that sort of sense that, throw up your hands.
I think that your premise is completely fair, that it is a very marginal sliver of people that you can potentially influence. I remember getting this question in Geneva when we had the dinner before we presented the 2014 report. Like, what's the point? People have already decided you're not going to influence anybody. I would offer a slightly different perspective. The men and women that we ask to fight these wars, they need to know that they're fighting for commanders who expect them to do it legally and morally. If you look at joint U.S. military doctrine today, it's added legitimacy as one of the core principles of joint military operations. And in the definition of legitimacy, it actually says legitimacy may be the decisive element in future conflicts. So if what you're doing is seeding this discussion to the distorted narrative of immorality and illegality and indifference to human suffering, I think after a while that has a corrosive effect of the morale of the soldiers that you're putting into battle, and the airmen and Marines.
Or
And so responding to that by emphasizing the nation and the institution's commitment to the law in the conduct of hostilities plays to different audiences. And I think what your point about the restriction of the media, what Hamas knows is that the best way to undermine the legitimacy of a military operation is to conflate it with a broader issue, the suffering of the people of Gaza. The suffering of the people of Gaza is tragic. I think most Israelis would agree with that. But what you do is you just make this another aspect of that suffering, and then you can continue to point the blame at the other side and that's diverting it from you.
I would just say that there's also a possibility that when you see more distorted coverage in more mainstream outlets of these recurring battles and wars between Israel and Hamas, the media institutions themselves suffer credibility and legitimacy problems, as well as we're seeing in other issues that are much broader than Israel. We live in a very, balkanized media environment right now. And in some ways, this, that the old rules of international media, where it was very important to try to, get a fair shake from the center, the CNNs and the BBCs, I'm wondering, at least in this country, half the country doesn't believe a word they say. So I'm not saying this is because of their coverage of the Gaza wars, but it's part of it in some ways, that when, yes, it doesn't mean the same thing when the New York Times runs a front page story about, Israel killing children in Gaza than it did 20 years ago.
I think that's true, but I also think that the value of events like this and reports like this is to provide a resource to journalists who are actually interested in getting an informed professional perspective on what actually happened. Look, my role in this is the minor role, which is this is the legal framework. The real experts are sitting between us, because as a lawyer, what I know is that an opinion is only as valuable as the foundation upon which it rests. And if you're gonna form your opinion of the respect for rules in war, in the conduct of hostilities, by only talking to people who've never had to make a decision in war, then the foundation for the opinion has limited probative value. I'm not saying it's irrelevant. You can have experts who haven't done A, B, and C, but when you've got a pool of experts who are willing to talk to you and say, let me explain to you how difficult this is and why I think this was a legitimate exercise of combat power and why it's something that I would have done had I been in that situation, to me, that's a highly valuable opinion. So creating events like this and reports like this provides a critical resource to better inform people. Now, if they don't want to listen to it or they're not interested in it, there's only so much you can do.
If I could real quick, so for my time in the military, and I'm sure everybody else would echo this, we're a learning organization. And so we are very reflective, and we're always looking for lessons learned, takeaways, and how do we apply it in future conflict. And so to Jeff's comment, this is something that we will study. The fact that we've codified this in a report allows the Defense Department to take this and leverage it and use it. But this is not new. And I think a really good example of our relationship with Israel, go back to 1973. So think about the 73 war. You have the Yom Kippur War kicks off, Syria and Egypt as they come over the canal. What did the U.S. military do after that? TRADOC had just been stood up, Training Doctrine Command. They actually sent a two-star general over, Don Story, to study the conflict to understand how the Israelis fought outnumbered and won. That gave birth to doctrine of active defense. It gave birth to air-land battle, which is kind of where we are right now as we're thinking about what the joint warfighting concept is. So the lessons can be very, very impactful from the nations that we study. In this case, the relationship and how we've studied the way of war for Israel has been hugely impactful on us and as a military. And there's tremendous lessons from this. that we will carry into how we think about the joint warfighting concept, how we implement JADC2 from a technology standpoint, which we haven't really dug into yet, and just some basic things for artificial intelligence and how they broke down stovepipes and created transparency in data. Because if you're watching JADC2 and everything we're talking about in the Defense Department, I mean, you've elevated a chief data officer who has direct access to the Deputy Secretary of Defense. They've created these data science teams that are going out of the combatant commanders to understand what data they have. The IDF has already started that process, and they've implemented practical lessons learned from that in terms of how they manage data, how they accelerated targeting, which will feed back into how we think about JADC2 and joint warfighting.
So with that, perhaps we can turn to questions from the audience. We have a question coming in from one of our online viewers, and let me remind those who are online that they can submit questions through the streaming platform, and if anyone here in the audience has a question, please raise your hand and I can bring you the mic. Our first question is from Stephanie Rowe, who asks, in LOAC, you mentioned the risk of commander hesitation. Do you ever see this risk embedding in additional leaders on site at the same time, creating an even bigger issue, driving a questioning, spoken or withheld, of each other? Is there a bigger issue here? Thank you.
So I think what the question is asking is whether the concern over the reality or the perception of causing damage to civilian property or civilian casualties can cause discord within a unit. Look, I think the answer, these gentlemen, I think, will be able to tell you the answer is clearly yes. Subordinates need to believe that their commanders are moral, are doing the right thing. And that's a hard line to walk. I mean, as General Ashley knows, we shared a quote from a kind of book that's mandatory reading for young officers in the military, Platoon Leader by James McDonough, who wrote the book from his experience in Vietnam in 1971. And he wasn't a lawyer, but he said, my job as a leader was to make my subordinates understand that there are certain lines they can't cross. So again, this goes back to the point about if all they're ever hearing is what they're doing is illegal, then it starts to erode confidence in the leadership that they're operating under, and I think that is a risk.
Yeah, first of all, it's a dilemma of leadership, and if you're in the U.S. military and don't trust your leadership, we have a problem. So it's an ongoing issue. I recall at the beginning of the Afghan response to the al-Qaeda attack in New York and D.C. and Pennsylvania, for that matter, we had a video teleconference with President Bush. He was in the White House. General Franks, who was a commander at CENTCOM, and myself were in Riyadh, or Prince Sultan Air Base. And we briefed how we were going to do the response to the 9/11 attack against the Taliban in Afghanistan to President Bush, the Vice President, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, and the Chairman of the JCS. And the briefing went for an hour and a half. We were the only two in there, General Franks and myself. My aide was there. And President Bush made a couple comments during the briefing, but not much. Nobody else said a word. And at the end of the briefing, President Bush said, okay, guys, I'm going to approve this, but here's the guidance. Number one, we're going to fight through Ramadan. Number two, I don't want you to hit any mosques. And three, this is your fight to fight, see it as you see fit. Now, that's top-level guidance and trusting guidance. I think the implication by Stephanie of this question from the standpoint of what about lower people questioning the validity of an attack, that's part of the ethos of our culture and the leadership challenge on a day-to-day basis. The same thing happens with the Israelis. And for those that haven't been around the Israeli military, they have a strong culture of clear guidance and morality. I can tell you that right now. But if that's ever questioned, you have a problem. If we've got young people in our military questioning the validity of a recommended attack, we've got a problem in our hands. That's a leadership issue. But I will tell you right now, I doubt that's a very serious issue in the Israeli military.
That's right. It does bring up, and the question brings up a great point about the uniqueness of this particular operation. So this we got to be careful not to learn lessons and apply them in places where the situation is completely different. Israeli commanders in this operation probably displayed what some looked at as great hesitation because they were more careful than they've been in other conflicts and will be able to be in other theaters in the way that they executed operations in Gaza. One, we had intelligence information. They had intelligence information that probably no one will ever have that level of detail ever again. So they could make decisions and be hesitant more in this operation than they would be able to be in another conflict. For example, if there's another northern conflict, or as the United States military to take that lesson and say, hey, that's the new bar for the hesitation that you have to maintain. It can't be done unless you have an identical situation there, and that's something we have to be careful to create an expectation that what the Israelis did in Gaza is something that all Western militaries need to be able to do in the future, and it's just not going to be doable.
And the strategic space they had. I mean, this goes to the point the Congresswoman made about supporting the continuing efficacy of Iron Dome. I mean, Iron Dome protected as many civilians in Gaza as it probably did in Israel because it gave the Israeli government and the Israeli military the strategic space to exercise that type of patience and restraint. If you disable it, imagine if that capability in the tower had been effective and had shut down Iron Dome. Then what's your option at that point once the missiles start hitting the civilian population centers?
But communication up and down the chain of command is absolutely critical because your soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, Coast Guardmen, and Guardians, civilians, contractors, everybody that's in that battle space needs to understand the why of what we're doing. I think the other key takeaway, though, also from a level of discipline, I think part of this gets back to Stephanie's question, is there were hundreds of targets that the IDF chose not to strike. That level of discipline. So the amount of cost, and we talked about this earlier, they could have inflicted was far less, and it gets really back into a values base. And as Professor Korn talked about, this is commander's judgment in the field. But part of what you also have to do as a commander is articulate that back to your leadership and those that you're in charge of.
Good morning, and thank you. Just a quick question. Oh, that's a fair point, isn't it? Bill DeRee with the UN. You mentioned in the summary that you talked with senior UN officials as part of your fact gathering. I was just wondering, without naming names, if you could give us, some sort of flavor for what they may have said. Was there any discussion, for example, about whether UN facilities were sufficiently marked, or, the destructive power of weapons that fell nearby and such? Thank you.
Yeah, I'll start with that. It was we reached out to try to speak with Palestinians from the West Bank. We obviously were aware we were not going to be able to go in and speak to Gazans. And so we did speak with one representative that was there. The flavor we got in that discussion was really we were digging for what is the perception of the Gazan people and how activities were accomplished there. And I thought we got a really, really good feedback in the fact that there is support, obviously, for Hamas, but it is not absolute inside Gaza. And I thought that was a very critical point, that there was also a feel that there was tremendous understanding of the average citizen in Gaza of what was happening. That there are certainly, the rallies and the people that are pushed up to the wall does not necessarily reflect all the people that live in Gaza that understand the limitations and restrictions that Israel was working under and appreciated what they had done. They told us about how the procedures that in the report we talk about knocking on the roof before they hit a target, where they would notify. Everybody in Gaza understood those procedures. So that communication had been very effective, where everybody understood that if you got the knock on the roof and they knew what that was, a very small munition that wouldn't penetrate the roof, that means you had 5 minutes. And that they appreciated that was the way that the conflict was being operated. So it was a very useful thing. There was not a lot of discussion about actual UN operations or facilities in Gaza.
If I can use my prerogative to ask a question, perhaps. General Ashley, you referred to some of the technological innovations that Israel was developing that might have analogs or lessons learned for the U.S. military. If you could talk about sort of what went into Israel being able to sustain this high operational tempo throughout the conflict and how that might apply to where the U.S. military is headed.
So Blaise, thanks for that. So Tom alluded to the unique nature of Gaza. So that's, you have to take that in the context of a very finite location where they have been developing targets for a long time. So their understanding, the intelligence is pretty rich. So they have a set number of targets that they're going to go after. But after that point, then you're looking at what's taking place on the ground. You got to be able to develop that in real time. So what General Hyman was able to do with support of General Kajavi and other leaders was look at how they managed information. So that's one of the huge challenges we have right now. So from a stovepipe transparency standpoint, what they were able to do is knock down the stovepipes, create transparency in how information was shared in the IDF. And then they applied artificial intelligence tools, computer vision, to be able to look and recognize from sensors targets in real time to be able to queue those up. Somebody puts eyes on it, so it's not automatic. So you've got a human in the loop making decisions, but it's accelerated by allowing the data feeds, leveraging artificial intelligence from a computer vision standpoint because they've fed in what some of these targets look like. And so they were able to accelerate the decision process to engage additional targets beyond what was already in the queue that they knew about as they presented themselves on the battlefield in Gaza. That is what we are trying to achieve from a U.S. standpoint with JADC2, with knocking down the stovepipes, with being able to process, apply AI, computer vision at the sensor level to have a library of targets that's part of the inventory, whether it's Chinese, Russian weapon systems, that we can have immediate identification by a sensor that puts it into the queue. Someone makes a deliberate decision whether to engage that target because we still keep our hand in the loop with a human making that decision. So they applied that. And so I think we can pull a lot of lessons out because we're still challenged right now to understand where our data is. We're still pretty stovepiped. And so that's a huge challenge right now for the Defense Department to kind of make that level of transparency. The other piece of technology I think is worth highlighting is really the precision munitions. So we heard that from the congressman. You cannot operate in an urban environment without that degree of precision. And the other piece of that, not only precision munitions, but Iron Dome itself. And I think Tom alluded to the comment that the ability to deny the benefit, right, back from a deterrence factor, of to be able to take out about 90% of the rockets that were fired in Israel allowed Israel to not feel the pressure to have a ground war into Gaza. So think about not having to bring that to fruition, how many Gazan citizens that saved, let alone Israeli citizens, and from what Iron Dome's able to apply. So the technology itself, both from artificial intelligence, from how they organize themselves, because there's part of what we talked about also with the IDF, there was a level of reorganization of some of the units. There's a cultural piece of this. We are facing a cultural piece of this and trusting some of that technology to be able to help accelerate the decision process. So huge lessons learned from a technology standpoint that you can look at, and then you can start scaling those to larger urban operations.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I think that, the technological part gets into the sophistication of what we're going to do in the future for our own military. But, again, it strikes me that the Israeli objective was to avoid killing innocents or non-combatants, and Hamas's actual objective was to try to kill Israeli non-combatants. I mean, there's something wrong with this discussion internationally from that perspective. There's no doubt in my mind, and I'm sure others would question it, but the Israelis went way out of their way to avoid innocent casualties. And it's ironic to me that Hamas's objective, number one objective, besides influence in the PA and others, was to actually inflict damage on and kill Israeli innocent civilians. It's
but
amazing.
They know that they're firing it into the Iron Dome, which
Well,
is
I mean,
90% effective.
but in spite of it, you can overwhelm things. I mean, the fact is they were hoping something would happen. But by the way, Iron Dome doesn't do a lot against mortars or artillery, or
Sure.
so. So the fact,
yeah. To change tactics to try to defeat Iron Dome. They used barrage fire, something they'd never tried to do, where they tried to overwhelm the Iron Dome. They launched rockets on very low trajectory, which was very successful, actually. Iron Dome was not able to get those shots in. A lot of the injuries that happened, of course, they can only reach a short distance out of Gaza using that tactic. But I believe they were trying their best to increase the lethality of the rockets, increase their tactics, or change their tactics in order to get past Iron Dome, and I thought they believed they could do that.
Well, but I thought that the understanding of in the report is that the objective of Hamas is to get Israel to kill civilians and then to broadcast those images all over the world and weaken its alliances with the United States and question the morality and all of these other things that we've been talking about. I mean, I have to assume that
No, I think that was absolutely critical.
They're not
to
entirely
their
delusional
objectives,
on
but
this,
they also expected to create civilian casualties
Okay.
on the Israeli side as well.
Well, I mean,
now their information campaign was built on the civilian casualties they expected to happen in Gaza, and
Right.
they were counting on that happening.
Yeah, so it's not just that they were trying to kill Israeli civilians.
they were trying to kill.
I think they were trying to
Palestinian.
kill their own civilians.
Yeah, no, they were-
They're using the Israeli military as their instrument to attack their own civilian population. That is a complicated equation, but when you look at the way things play out, what is going to create a more heavy-handed response against them? It's going to be overwhelming Iron Dome or being effective in killing Israeli civilians, because that's going to put pressure on the Israeli government to be more aggressive in their self-defense response. So it's a dual objective. But I want to go back to the point that General Ashley made about technology. I don't think we should miss the fact that the enhancement and integration of technology in the battle command process is itself a precautionary measure under the law of armed conflict. The more information you have, the faster you can assess it, the more you can use artificial intelligence to better inform that commander's judgment, the better you're going to focus your attacks on legitimate targets, mitigate risks to the civilian population, and one of the reasons that the casualties were so much lower in 2021 versus 2014 was because of a commitment by an institution to enable commanders to achieve their objectives in a way that complies with the law. And we should be understanding that. And when we make these investments into these processes, there should be an alternate emphasis, which is it's not just to enhance operational or tactical effectiveness, it's also to enhance our legitimacy and our ability to execute operations in a way that complies with the law and gives commanders the ability to say that in good faith.
Because we did make the point that the Al Jalal building, which everybody saw in the news, collapsed, no casualties. The building had been cleared. They were very deliberate. They watched it. They called leaflets, knock on the roof, and then that is a bar in future conflicts, depending on pace of their operations, that will be very difficult, if not impossible, to achieve. So
Even that led to criticism because there were some international law experts that said once it was evacuated, it was no longer a military target, which again is a distortion of the law because a military target is not just defined by how it's used, but how it will be used. So if you tell the enemy to get out of a building they're using as an observation point, it doesn't cease becoming a military target if you make a reasonable judgment they're going to go right back in. And yet that's the narrative that is played out.
Well, I think that's as good a point to stop the conversation as any. I want to thank our panel and thank everyone else for watching.
Thank you, Eli. Thanks to our panel. I want to also thank Congresswoman Luria for her remarks earlier and to all the JINSA staff and team that pulled this together. A reminder that you can find the JINSA report on the Gaza conflict on our website at jinsa.org and look forward to seeing everyone at our future events. Thank you very much.